On February 16th, 2026, a Sunday, chosen deliberately, Hyatt Hotels Corporation posted a press release to its newsroom. The language was the language of corporate succession, retirement, board appointment, effective immediately. No photographs, no press conference, just sentences formatted for the SEC announcing that Thomas Pritzker, the man who had served as executive chairman for more than 2 decades and had been inside the company's highest offices since 1980, was stepping down. Effective immediately. Not at the end of a quarter, not at the annual meeting. Now. Somewhere in the gap between those careful sentences and the speed of the departure was a story that no corporate filing was designed to tell. A story about 20 emails to a convicted sex offender, dinner guest lists that treated young women as decoration, and the phrase terrible judgment written by a man whose entire life had been built on the opposite claim. The Pritsker name had meant something in America for more than a century. It meant Hyatt hotels on 6 continents. It meant architecture prizes in medical schools and a fortune held inside 1,000 family trusts. It meant Chicago philanthropy, political power, and the kind of private wealth that builds institutions and expects to be remembered for building them. What nobody outside the family's innermost circles understood was how much that privacy had concealed, and for how long. This is the story of the Pritskers. From a 10-year-old immigrant arriving in Chicago in 1881 to a $15 billion empire, a family trust war that split the dynasty apart, and the Epstein documents that brought the most visible heir's 46-year career to a Sunday ending. It is a story about what dynastic wealth builds, what it hides, and what happens when the paper trail finally becomes public. But that corporate press release, those careful, bloodless sentences about retirement and board succession, did not arrive out of nowhere. To understand how a family that had spent more than a century building one of the most disciplined private empires in American history ended up watching its most visible steward walk away from the top of a Fortune 500 company in a single afternoon, you have to go back. Not to the Epstein emails, not to the Hyatt boardroom. You have to go back to a 10-year-old boy arriving in Chicago in the winter of 1881 with nothing that resembled power and everything that would eventually produce it. The Pritzker name, for most of the 20th century, meant something specific. It meant hotels, it meant hospitals and architecture prizes, and university buildings with brass plaques. It meant a particular kind of Chicago wealth, civic, institutional, private in the way that real money prefers to be private. The family was not tabloid. They were not flashy. They did not build towers with their name in gold letters across the facade. They were the kind of rich that showed up on donor walls and trustee lists and in the quiet language of endowed chairs, not on magazine covers or gossip columns. Forbes tracked them because Forbes tracks everyone above a certain threshold. Society columnists left them largely alone. That was the arrangement, and for decades it held. The man who started it all was Nicholas J. Pritsker. And his story is the one the family told whenever they needed to explain themselves. He arrived in Chicago from Kiev in November of 1881. He was 10 years old. He sold newspapers on street corners. He worked as a tailor's assistant and then in a pharmacy. He attended law school at night. The kind of bootstrapping detail that American dynasties love because it makes the fortune feel like a reward rather than an accident. On June 5th, 1902, he opened a law firm called Pritsker and Pritsker. That is the origin the family honored, the story they returned to at fundraising galas and university dedications, and the private gatherings where older Pritskers explained to younger Pritskers what the name was supposed to mean. Immigrant discipline, law school by lamplight, a shingle on a door in a city that rewarded ambition if you were willing to grind for it. It is also, not coincidentally, the origin that justified everything that came after. If the fortune began with a boy who had nothing, then the fortune was earned. And if the fortune was earned, then the family that controlled it had the moral authority to decide how it should be used, who should benefit, and who should be trusted with its future. Nicholas's son, Abram, Nicholas Pritzker, expanded the family's legal and investment work into something broader: real estate, business acquisitions, the early infrastructure of what would eventually become a diversified empire. Abram understood leverage. He understood that a law practice could become a holding structure, and a holding structure could become an engine. But Abram was the bridge, not the builder. The man who turned the Pritzker instinct for accumulation into a true American dynasty was Abram's son, J. Pritzker, born in 1922. Jay was the force, not the loudest voice in the room. That was never the Pritzker style, but the most certain one. He understood earlier and more clearly than anyone else in the family that the fortune his grandfather had started and his father had expanded was at a crossroads. It could remain a collective instrument, controlled and productive and growing, or it could be divided among heirs and slowly diluted across generations into ordinary wealth. He chose the first option. He spent the next 5 decades engineering the structures to enforce that choice, and he never stopped believing that the structures would hold. Jay's empire was staggering in its scope and deliberate in its opacity. By the time it was fully assembled, it included more than 200 companies held through a network of roughly 1,000 family trusts. The centerpiece, the piece the public could see, was Hyatt. In 1957, Jay bought the Hyatt House Motel beside Los Angeles International Airport. It was a roadside property near the new geography of American air travel, the kind of acquisition that looks modest in retrospect and visionary only because of what came after. Jay and his brother Donald grew it over the following decade into a North American hotel ownership and management company, formed Hyatt International in 1968, and built the chain into a global brand. But Hyatt was the visible fraction. The family also held Marmon Group, a sprawling industrial conglomerate. They held interests in Royal Caribbean, TransUnion, Ticketmaster, commercial real estate portfolios that stretched across the country. The businesses were diversified. The control was not. Jay kept the trusts interlocking, the management centralized, and the heirs accountable to the collective rather than to themselves. There is something about that structure worth sitting with for a moment because it explains almost everything that follows. The Pritsker trusts were not ordinary inheritance vehicles. They were control instruments. They determined not just who got money, but who made decisions, who had authority, who was inside the succession plan, and who could be excluded from it entirely. Jay did not want his children and nieces and nephews to simply be rich. He wanted them to be useful. He wanted them to serve the family enterprise, not merely collect from it. That is a noble sounding principle, and in some respects it was genuinely noble. It produced philanthropy, institution building, and a sense of obligation that many American fortunes never develop. It also meant that the family's internal power structure depended entirely on who administered the trusts and what they decided a reasonable need was. In a family of billionaires, the person who controls the trust is not a bureaucrat. That person is a king. And the question of who gets to be king, and then whether the king is serving the family or serving himself, is the question that destroys dynasties. Jay's succession plan reflected that understanding. He chose 3 people to carry the empire forward after his death: his eldest son, Thomas, his niece, Penny Pritsker, Donald's daughter, and his nephew, Nicholas Pritsker. Each was selected for a reason. Each carried a piece of what Jay believed the family needed to survive. Tom was the steward. He was Jay's eldest, born and raised in Chicago, educated at Claremont Men's College for his undergraduate degree, and then at the University of Chicago for both his MBA and his law degree, the same university whose medical school would later carry the family name. He began senior executive responsibilities for the family's business entities in 1980, when he was still in his 20s, and he never left. He became president of Hyatt Corporation that same year. He moved through chairman and CEO roles across the next 2 decades. His public biography reads like a list designed to communicate one thing: seriousness. The Pritsker organization, the family's merchant bank, identifies him as active in the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Aspen Strategy Group, the Hyatt Foundation, the University of Chicago Board, the Art Institute of Chicago, Biotech Ventures, Archaeological Research, and China-related scholarly initiatives. Tom was not just a hotel heir. He was a node in culture, national security, philanthropy, and elite academic life. His identity depended on sober institutional legitimacy. He was the chosen steward of a fortune built on privacy, and he wore that role the way some men wear a tailored suit, so consistently that it became indistinguishable from the person inside it. Penny was the political operator. Donald's daughter, she was one of the first women to rise into the family's top business structure, a structure that had been designed by men, administered by men, and calibrated to male authority for 3 generations. She was hard-driving and competent, and her role in this succession was not decorative. Jay named her to the triumvirate because he recognized that the family needed more than quiet stewardship. It needed someone who could navigate the public-facing dimensions of powers, politics, institution, the kind of social capital that translates into influence beyond boardrooms. Penny would later serve as United States Secretary of Commerce. That trajectory was already visible in the role Jay assigned her. The Pritzker, who understood that money alone does not protect a dynasty, relationships do. The third pillar was Nicholas, and together the three of them were supposed to hold the architecture intact. Jay believed that a triumvirate would be more stable than a single heir, that 3 minds making decisions would prevent the kind of concentrated misjudgment that brought other dynasties down. It was a rational plan. It assumed rational actors. But the succession plan had a fault line that Jay either could not see or chose not to address. His brother Robert, co-builder of the empire, the industrial arm of the family, the man whose Marmon group represented the Pritzker's presence in manufacturing and heavy industry and had children too. Robert's older children were part of the system. His younger children, Liesl and Matthew, were not. They were minors when the critical restructuring decisions were being made. They were beneficiaries of the trusts, their names printed on legal documents that governed hundreds of millions of dollars. But they were not participants in the conversations about how those trusts would be managed, divided, or redirected. Their names were inside the architecture. Their voices were not inside the room. In June of 1995, Jay Pritsker tried to explain the roles one last time. He was 73 years old. His health was beginning to decline, and the question of what would happen to the family after his death had shifted from theoretical to urgent. He gathered the adult heirs at Tom's apartment on Lakeview Drive in Chicago. The setting matters. This was not a boardroom. It was not a law office. It was a living room, Tom's living room. And the family members who came sat in the kind of space where you might discuss a holiday or a child's school or what to have for dinner. That domesticity was the point, or at least a performance. Jay handed each of them a 2-page letter. The letter explained that the trusts were not personal wealth. The money was collective. The money was productive. The money was meant to serve the family enterprise, not to turn each descendant into an independent billionaire. Jay wanted them to understand that before the money destroyed them, the way money had destroyed so many American families before. Liesl was 11 years old that summer. Matthew was 13. They were not invited. They were not told what the letter said. They were beneficiaries of a system whose rules were being explained to everyone except them. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this part of the story, because it establishes the pattern the Pritzker dynasty would repeat for the next 3 decades. The people most affected by the family's private arrangements were the last to know what those arrangements contained. Jay suffered a major stroke in 1997. He died in January of 1999. Nearly 1,000 mourners came to Emmanuel Congregation in Chicago for his funeral. Political figures, business leaders, cultural patrons, philanthropic partners, they filled the pews for a man who had built a $15 billion empire and kept it, by sheer force of will and legal engineering, inside a single family. Tom and his brothers John and Daniel were there. Penny was there. The heirs sat together at the front of the congregation, visible to everyone behind them, a tableau of unity in dark clothing. The photograph of that day is the family together, grieving together, still bound by the name and the fortune and the obligations Jay had spent his life defining, was the last public image of the Pritzkers as a collective enterprise. The funeral felt like an ending. It was, but not the kind anyone in the front row expected. What Jay had built was by almost any measure extraordinary. Hyatt alone had grown from a single roadside motel near LAX into an international hotel company with properties on multiple continents. The family unified the company under Hyatt Hotels Corporation in 2004 and took it public in 2009. The Pritzker Architecture Prize, endowed through the Hyatt Foundation, had become the highest honor in global design. Architecture's Nobel, awarded annually with the weight and prestige that attached permanence to the family name. The University of Chicago bore the Pritzker name on its medical school. The family's philanthropic footprint covered medicine, education, molecular engineering, art, and public policy. In 2002, the family gave $30 million to the University of Chicago, and Thomas Pritzker said the family had prospered in Chicago and felt an obligation to give back. That word, obligation, was the family's chosen language. It said, "We are not simply rich. We are responsible. We give because we owe." The public grammar of philanthropy was, for the Pritzkers, a grammar of legitimacy. It made the private arrangements underneath feel reasonable rather than suspicious. At its peak, the Pritzker Empire was the closest thing America had produced to a European-style dynastic house. Wealth managed collectively, identity maintained institutionally, succession planned generationally. The public image was almost ideal. Immigrant origin to hotel empire to philanthropic infrastructure, a family that appeared to have solved the billionaire dynasty problem. The problem of how to keep money productive, heirs purposeful, and the family name respected across multiple generations. And through all of it, Tom was the visible hand. He had been president of Hyatt Corporation since 1980. He became chairman and CEO of Hyatt Corporation in 1999, the year Jay died, as a transition that was not a coincidence but a culmination, the son stepping into the chair the father had built. He would serve as CEO of the Unified Hyatt Hotels Corporation from 2004 to 2006, and then as executive chairman from 2004 all the way to 2026. More than 4 decades inside the highest levels of the family's most important company. His reach extended well beyond hotels. He sat on boards that dealt with global security and foreign policy. He funded archaeological expeditions. He chaired philanthropic foundations. He moved through the world the way the Pritzker fortune was designed to move through the world. Quietly, seriously, with the gravity of someone who understood that the name on the building was not just a brand but a promise. But none of that institutional solidity could address the private tension that Jay's death had unlocked. The family's greatest strength was privacy. The family's greatest vulnerability was also privacy. Because once Jay was gone, the architecture he had left behind turned out to be more fragile than it looked. Tom, Penny, and Nicholas took over day-to-day operations as Jay had intended, but the internal dynamics shifted in ways that were invisible to the public and deeply felt inside the family. Resentment that had been suppressed by Jay's authority began to surface. Suspicion about how the trusts were being managed deepened among heirs, who had accepted the collective model when Jay was alive and began to question it now that he was not. The family had been held together not by the trusts themselves, but by the man who created them. Remove the man, and the trusts became what they always were underneath, legal instruments, subject to interpretation, open to challenge, and only as fair as the people administering them believed they needed to be. The question Jay had spent his entire life trying to suppress. Whose money is this, really? He started to press outward against the walls of the trust system he had built. For 3 years after the funeral, the walls held, and then they did not. And then, in November of 2002, the wall broke. Liesl Pritsker was 19 years old. She had been briefly a child actress. She appeared in a film under the name Liesl Matthews, a screen credit that belonged to another life, and she was now a college student. She was also, according to the trust documents that bore her name, a beneficiary of the Pritzker family fortune. What she had discovered, or what her lawyers had helped her discover, was that the fortune she had been promised was not where it was supposed to be. She filed a lawsuit against her father, Robert Pritzker, and other family members. The allegations were specific. Her trust funds and Matthews had been looted. The damages she sought were enormous. And the case, once filed, did something the Pritzker family had spent a century and 1,000 trusts trying to prevent. It forced the private machinery into public view. Think about what that required. A 19-year-old woman raised inside one of the wealthiest families in America walking into a courthouse to sue her own father and the relatives whose last name she shared. The Pritzker identity was built on loyalty, on collective purpose, on the idea that the family was stronger together than apart. Liesl's lawsuit did not just challenge the financial arrangements, it challenged the mythology. It said, this family that talks about obligation and stewardship has been making decisions about my money without telling me. And I am done being quiet about it. The lawsuit exposed a confidential 2001 plan to break up the family empire over 10 years and distribute assets among participating family members. The plan was detailed, it was organized. It had been negotiated among the adult heirs and their lawyers. And Liesel and Matthew were not among the participants. They had been excluded from the restructuring of the very fortune they were supposed to inherit. The trust that bore their names had been treated, according to the lawsuit, not as their protected inheritance, but as available capital for the family's broader reorganization. You have to understand what that meant inside the family. These were not distant relatives suing over a forgotten codicil. This was a daughter suing her father. This was a young woman standing in front of the Daily Center in Chicago and telling the legal system that the people who were supposed to protect her had taken what was hers. Robert denied wrongdoing. He said he had acted properly as trustee, that his decisions had been appropriate and within the bounds of his fiduciary obligations. The family's lawyers pushed back on the public narrative. Tom appeared in this section of the story not as a villain, but as something more uncomfortable. The chosen steward, caught inside the machinery his father had designed, serving a system whose fairness was now being challenged by the very people it was supposed to protect. Penny's role was business authority under pressure, the competent executor whose competence could not resolve a dispute that was not really about competence at all. It was about trust, in the oldest and most human sense of the word. The children whose names were inside the legal trust had not been trusted with the knowledge of what was being done with their money. That was the fracture, not greed, not crime. Something closer to the arrogance of privacy. The assumption that the people most affected did not need to be in the room. The settlement came in 2005. Liesel and Matthew each received roughly $280 million in cash, plus earlier amounts they had already kept. Robert continued to deny wrongdoing. The family issued no public apology, no acknowledgement that the system had failed the youngest heirs, no reckoning with the question of whether Jay's collective model had been a form of stewardship or a form of control. The legal system had done what Jay's two-page letter could not. It had forced a reckoning with the question of who the trust actually belonged to. But a settlement is not a resolution. It is a price paid to make the exposure stop. The Pritzkers paid it. The exposure stopped. And the family, diminished but still enormously powerful, and still holding Hyatt, still holding commercial real estate and industrial businesses, and a stake in Royal Caribbean, still sitting on trustee boards and donor walls across Chicago, moved forward. There is a version of this story in which the trust war is the whole story. A powerful family's private financial arrangements exposed by the youngest members, a painful settlement, an uneasy peace. In that version, the Pritskers are an American cautionary tale about inherited wealth and the limits of patriarchal control. It would be a neat arc. But the trust war was not the whole story. It was the first act. What the trust war proved was narrow but important. The Pritzker system could survive public exposure of its financial arrangements. The family's reputation took damage, but the damage was contained to a category the public already understood. Rich family fights over money. The name remained on the hospitals. The name remained on the architecture prize. Tom remained in the executive chairman's seat at Hyatt. Penny remained in the family's business and political networks. The empire had cracked, but it had not broken, because the crack was financial. The public could understand financial disputes. The public could forgive them, or at least forget them. The public had watched the trust war with the detached interest reserved for billionaire family disputes. It was ugly, but it was familiar. Heirs fighting over money, trustees accused of self-dealing, a settlement with a lot of zeros. The story fit a known category, and known categories are comfortable. They do not keep people up at night. The Pritzker trust war did not suggest that anything darker was running beneath the surface of the family's world. The documents that became public were financial. They concerned trusts, assets, restructuring plans, and dollar amounts. They were embarrassing. They were not morally radioactive. The family had already learned that paper could break privacy. 20 years later, paper would do it again. And the second time, the documents would not be about money. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. The empire, after the trust war, did what empires do when they survive a fracture. It reorganized, it modernized, it moved forward. Hyatt Hotels Corporation unified the family's hotel interest under a single corporate umbrella in 2004, with Tom as executive chairman and later CEO, and in 2009, the company went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The IPO was a signal to the market and to the world. The Pritzkers were not a family in retreat. They were institutionalizing. They were professionalizing. They were doing what Jay had always wanted the family to do, building something that could outlast any single generation, any single scandal, any single lawsuit filed by a teenager with 280 million reasons to be angry. The years between the trust settlement and the Epstein disclosures were, from the outside, the Pritsker restoration. Tom oversaw the transition from private family company to publicly traded corporation, navigating the governance demands that come with outside shareholders and SEC reporting requirements while preserving the family's controlling interest. Hyatt expanded internationally. The brand portfolio grew. The Pritzker Architecture Prize continued to be awarded each year with the solemnity and prestige of a Nobel ceremony. The family's philanthropic infrastructure, the hospitals, the university chairs, the museum boards, the public policy forums, continued to operate as it always had, generating the kind of reputational capital that turns a rich family into a respected institution. And the control remained. That is the detail that mattered most inside the corporate architecture. A January 2026 ownership report showed that the broader Pritzker family group beneficially owned 54.4% of Hyatt's total common stock and 88.9% of total voting power, concentrated through Class B shares that carried disproportionate authority. Even after the IPO, even after the trust war, even after the family's private arrangements had been dragged into courtrooms and newspaper columns, the Pritzkers still controlled Hyatt the way Jay had always intended, through structure, not sentiment. The public owned shares, the family owned the vote. That distinction is the architecture of dynastic survival, and it held. Tom remained at the center. He had been executive chairman since 2004. He sat on the board. He maintained his positions with the Pritsker organization, the family's merchant bank. His biography continued to grow: CSIS, Aspen, the University of Chicago, the Art Institute, biotech, archaeology, China studies. He was not merely running a hotel company. He was curating an identity. The identity said, I am serious, I am institutional, I am the kind of person who sits on national security advisory boards and funds archaeological excavations in Central Asia. That identity was not false. It was, by every available account, genuinely who Tom Pritzker was. But identity, when it depends on institutional legitimacy, is also a kind of exposure. The higher you build the reputation, the further it falls when the foundation cracks. The foundation was about to crack. And the crack would not come from inside the family this time. It would come from a set of relationships that had nothing to do with Hyatt, nothing to do with trust, nothing to do with Chicago philanthropy, and everything to do with the kind of access that immense wealth provides to rooms the public never sees. The rooms in question were not metaphorical, they were real rooms. In real houses, on real islands, where real people gathered at the invitation of a man whose name would become the most toxic 3 syllables in American public life. Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008 to soliciting prostitution from an underage girl. He served 13 months in a Palm Beach County jail under a work release arrangement that allowed him to spend 12 hours a day at his office, a sentence that itself became a symbol of the kind of justice wealth could purchase. He registered as a sex offender. The conviction was public. The nature of the offense was public. Then, in the way that wealth and social capital have always worked in America, Epstein continued to move through elite spaces. He attended dinners. He hosted gatherings at his Manhattan townhouse, at his ranch in New Mexico, at his island in the Caribbean. He maintained correspondences with powerful men in finance, in politics, in academia, in business. And those men, for reasons the public record can document but not fully explain, continued to engage with him. Some later claimed ignorance of the conviction's details. Some claimed they were trying to distance themselves. Some simply did not respond when the question was raised. What is not in dispute is this: after Epstein's 2008 conviction, his social world did not collapse. It contracted, but it did not end. The doors closed at some institutions and remained open at others. And Thomas Pritzker was inside the rooms that stayed open. The emails tell that story with a specificity that no resignation statement can undo. Documents released by Congress from Epstein's estate showed at least 20 back-and-forth emails between Thomas Pritzker and Jeffrey Epstein, stretching from at least 2010 to early 2019. 20 emails across 9 years. That is not a passing acquaintance. That is not a man who failed to cut ties quickly enough and then moved on. That is a sustained correspondence with a convicted sex offender, maintained across nearly a decade through scheduling exchanges and social check-ins that read like the ordinary maintenance of a relationship between people who considered each other part of the same world. The emails did not contain, as far as the public record shows, discussions of criminal activity. They contained something that may be worse for the purposes of understanding how elite social networks function. They contained normalcy, scheduling, travel plans, The casual back and forth of two people who were, by every measure the emails reveal, comfortable with each other. One exchange from August of 2016 involved catching up in New York and Santa Fe. The kind of casual social planning that happens between people who share a calendar of seasonal locations, who winter in one place and summer in another, who move through the geography of extreme wealth, the way most people move through a neighborhood. New York in the fall, Santa Fe when the light is good. These are not the coordinates of conspiracy. They are the coordinates of privilege, and their ordinariness is precisely the point. 8 years after Epstein's conviction for a sex offense involving a minor, a billionaire hotel executive and philanthropist was making plans to see him in two of America's most exclusive enclaves. Another exchange from February of 2019 is the one that lands hardest. Epstein wrote to Pritzker, "News?" Pritzker replied that Epstein was news and he was quiet. That was February of 2019, 5 months before Epstein was arrested on federal sex trafficking charges in July. 6 months before Epstein died by suicide in a Manhattan federal detention center while awaiting trial. A billionaire writing to a convicted sex offender that he was quiet, in a tone that reads as familiar, almost teasing, as though the relationship between them was comfortable enough for that kind of shorthand. There is something about that exchange worth sitting with, because it captures the texture of what elite proximity to Epstein actually looked like in practice. It was not dramatic. It was not sinister in the way Hollywood depicts sinister. It was casual, it was scheduling, it was news, and a reply. The banality is what makes it so difficult to dismiss. But the Epstein connection was not the only thread, and in some ways it was not even the most revealing one. The Ghislaine Maxwell correspondence went back even further and landed in a different register entirely. Newly released emails between Pritsker and Maxwell dated back to at least 2001, 7 years before Epstein's first conviction, a period when Maxwell was functioning as Epstein's closest associate, his social organizer, the person who managed the logistics of his world of access and introduction. The emails between Pritzker and Maxwell suggested a close personal relationship that extended well beyond business or philanthropy. They included sexually suggestive exchanges, a tone of familiarity and innuendo that does not exist between casual acquaintances or between a hotel executive and a peripheral social contact. These were people who knew each other well enough to write to each other the way friends write, loosely, with private jokes, with the kind of comfort that comes from years of social overlap. One exchange from 2003, reported in detail after the documents became public, involved a dinner guest list. Maxwell listed expected guests and noted 5 models as serving girls. Pritzker's reply suggested reversing the arrangement, making the models the guests and the invited guests the servers. The language was playful. The context was not. This was a dinner organized by a woman who would later be convicted of sex trafficking and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, attended by a man whose public identity rested on institutional seriousness, and the conversation about the event treated young women as atmospheric decoration. Interchangeable, rearrangeable, part of the scenery, rather than people with names and futures. The exchange was not evidence of a crime. It was evidence of a culture in which models at a dinner were discussed the way caterers discuss table settings, as an element to be arranged for the comfort and amusement of the people who mattered. That dinner exchange matters because it reveals the social grammar of the world Epstein and Maxwell inhabited. It was a world of guest lists and models, of invitations extended and roles assigned, of wealth so concentrated that it could turn people into furniture and call it hospitality. Tom Pritzker's presence in that correspondence, not as a bystander, but as a participant, someone who responded to the guest list with a suggestion of his own, placed him inside that grammar, not as a convicted criminal, not as a charged defendant, but as someone comfortable enough in that world to make a joke about it. The outline must be precise here, because precision is what separates documentation from accusation. Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, named Pritzker in a 2016 deposition as someone who had sex with her on one occasion. Pritzker has denied wrongdoing. He has not been charged with any crime related to Epstein or the investigations that followed Epstein's death. The deposition is part of the public record. The denial is part of the public record. Both belong in the story. Neither should be treated as dispositive. What is clear, without any disputed allegation, is that the documented email trail alone, the 20 exchanges with Epstein after his conviction, the Maxwell correspondence going back to 2001, the dinner lists, the scheduling, the casual tone, was enough to make Thomas Pritzker's position at the head of a Fortune 500 company untenable once the documents became public. And the documents did not become public all at once. That is part of what made the unraveling so particular to this era. Epstein died by suicide in a Manhattan federal detention center in August of 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. His death created an immediate public assumption that the full scope of his network, the names of the powerful men who had moved through his world, would be buried with him. For a time, that assumption appeared correct. The criminal case ended with the defendant's death. The civil cases continued, but civil cases produced settlements, and settlements produced silence. The network seemed as though it might remain sealed. It did not. Beginning in 2025 and accelerating into 2026, Congress and DOJ-related releases put the paper trail back into circulation. The Epstein Files Transparency Act firmly created a mechanism for disclosure. Courts unsealed depositions and exhibits. Congressional committees published caches of correspondence. What had been private became public on a rolling basis, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in a series of document dumps that gave journalists, researchers, and the public weeks and months to read, cross-reference, and connect names to emails to events. The Pritsker name surfaced in that process. It surfaced not as a footnote, but as a recurring presence. 20 emails, dinner lists, scheduling exchanges, a deposition allegation, a pattern of sustained social contact with a convicted sex offender that stretched across nearly 2 decades of correspondence. And the broader context explains the velocity of the consequences. Pritsker was not the only powerful figure whose Epstein associations were being exposed in this period. The wave that began with document releases from Congress and DOJ-related investigations had already produced consequences across the upper reaches of American and global power. DP World, the Dubai-based port operator, saw leadership changes. Goldman Sachs's Kathy Remler, who had served as White House counsel under President Obama, departed from the firm. Paul Weiss, one of the most powerful law firms in the country, lost its chairman, Brad Karp. Prince Andrew's ongoing fallout from his own Epstein associations continued to erode whatever remained of his public role in British life. Each case was different in its specifics. Each case shared the same underlying dynamic. Documents that had been sealed or private or simply undisclosed were now public, and the public was no longer willing to accept the social fiction that proximity to Epstein after his conviction was merely an oversight. The Pritzker resignation was not an isolated event. It was part of a reckoning, slow, uneven, incomplete, but real, with the social system that had allowed a convicted sex offender to maintain relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world for years after his conviction. The system had not been built by Epstein alone. It had been built by the people who continued to answer his emails, attend his dinners, and treat him as a member of their world after the world knew what he had done to children. The Department of Justice had created what it called the Epstein Library, an online archive of materials responsive to the Epstein Files Transparency Act, last updated in April of 2026, with a warning that some materials concern sexual assault and the search functionality might be limited by technical constraints. That warning, clinical and bureaucratic, was its own kind of revelation. The government was telling the public, here are the documents, but be aware that what you find may be disturbing. It was an archive that would not close. It would be updated, it would be searched, it would be cited. The Pritzker name was inside that archive, it would remain there. And unlike a trust settlement, which can be signed and sealed and eventually forgotten, a federal document archive has no expiration date. And then came February 16th, 2026, a Sunday. The day that corporations choose when they want the news cycle to absorb a story before the markets open on Monday. The sequence of that day can be told almost entirely through documents, because documents are what the Pritsker dynasty had always used to manage its private reality. Trusts, agreements, filings, letters, and documents are what finally undid the public image. Hyatt Hotels Corporation issued a press release. The language was corporate, the syntax bloodless, the formatting identical to hundreds of other succession announcements that publicly traded companies issue every year. Thomas J. Pritzker had informed the board of directors that he would retire as executive chairman effective immediately and would not seek re-election to the board at the company's annual meeting in May. The board had appointed Mark S. Hoplamazian, Hyatt's president and CEO since 2006, to serve as chairman of the board in addition to his existing roles, effective immediately. Effective immediately. Those two words carried the weight of more than 4 decades. Tom Pritzker had begun his senior executive responsibilities with the family's business entities in 1980. He had been on the Hyatt board and served as executive chairman since August of 2004. He had been the face of Pritzker stewardship at Hyatt for longer than many of the company's employees had been alive. And now, in a single press release, timed for a Sunday, the day corporations choose when they want the market to absorb the news before Monday trading opens, he was gone from the top of the company his family had built. The SEC filing told the same story in regulatory language. Item 5.02, departure of directors or certain officers. Thomas J. Pritzker would serve the remainder of his term as a Class II director, but would not stand for re-election. The filing noted that the decision was not due to any disagreement with the company over operations, policies, or practices. That sentence is standard legal boilerplate. Companies include it to signal that the departure is not a governance crisis, not a dispute over strategy or accounting or corporate direction. But the sentence also carried an unintended meaning, one that the drafters almost certainly recognized even as they included the required language. The departure was not about operations or policies. It was about something the SEC's standard form did not have a checkbox for: a paper trail linking the company's executive chairman to a dead sex trafficker and his convicted accomplice. The form asked whether the departure involved a disagreement. It did not ask whether the departure involved shame. Then came the personal statement. Tom Pritzker said he deeply regretted his association with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. He said he had shown terrible judgment in maintaining contact. He condemned the harm Epstein and Maxwell had caused. He expressed sorrow for the victims. The language was regret, not defense. It was an admission framed as a resignation, or a resignation framed as an admission. The order depended on which sentence you read first. What it was not, in any reading, was a denial. He did not say the emails were fabricated. He did not say the relationships were mischaracterized. He did not say the dinners never happened. He said he had shown terrible judgment. He said there was no excuse for not distancing himself sooner. There is something about those words, terrible judgment, that deserves careful attention. This was a man whose entire public identity had been built on judgment, on stewardship, on fiduciary responsibility, on the sober institutional seriousness that distinguished the Pritzkers from flashier American fortunes. Jay had chosen Tom precisely because Tom was supposed to be the one who made good decisions, who weighed risks, who understood that the family name was not just a brand but a trust in the moral sense, not merely the legal one. And now the chosen steward was telling the world that his judgment had failed him in the most consequential way possible, not in a business deal, not in a market bet, in the decision to remain socially connected to a man convicted of a sex crime involving a child and to a woman who helped him do it. That admission was devastating precisely because it was true. The company moved quickly, because companies always move quickly when the alternative is uncertainty. Hoplamazian assumed the combined chairman and CEO role. Hyatt's messaging emphasized stability, long-term growth, the continuation of strategy, the dual-class ownership structure, the architecture that gave the Pritzker family its voting control. It was not affected by Tom's departure. One provision in the 2007 stockholders' agreement terminated when he ceased being executive chairman, a technical detail that mattered to securities lawyers and almost no one else. The man was gone. The structure remained. In a dynasty story, that is the most important sentence you can write. The visible figure changes, but the architecture of control does not vanish overnight. Tom Pritzker was 75 years old. He was a cousin of J.B. Pritsker, the sitting governor of Illinois, a connection that ensured the resignation would ripple beyond the hotel industry and into political coverage. He was a member of one of the wealthiest families in American history, a family whose name was on hospitals and prizes in schools, a family that had survived an inheritance war and a public IPO and the death of its patriarch and the fracturing of its collective model. The family had survived all of that because the exposure had always remained within a category the public could process: financial disputes, corporate transitions, the ordinary machinery of dynastic succession. This was different. This was not about how the money was divided. This was about what the money had access to. The University of Chicago student newspaper connected the episode to Tom's role as a university trustee and reported that a spokesperson said he would retire from that board in June after reaching mandatory retirement age, a framing that allowed the departure to appear routine even as its timing made routine impossible. The Pritzker organization's website still listed him as chairman and CEO. His biography still described his work with CSIS, the Aspen Strategy Group, the University of Chicago, the Art Institute, scientific and archaeological initiatives. The institutional footprint had not been erased. It had been made awkward. And in the world of elite philanthropy and governance, awkwardness is its own kind of exile. What had happened on February 16th was not a criminal proceeding. It was not an indictment. It was not a jury verdict. It was something the American legal system does not have a name for. A man losing his institutional identity because the private documents that defined his social world became public. The resignation was the consequence. The emails were the cause. And the distance between those two facts, between terrible judgment and a 46-year career ending in a Sunday press release, was the space where the Pritsker dynasty's real story lived. The tragedy had occurred. But its aftermath, for the family, for Hyatt, for the institutions that bore the Pritsker name, for the question of what accountability means when the person who leaves the title keeps the fortune, was only beginning. The morning after was not a morning. It was a Monday, the February 17th, 2026, and the markets opened with the news already absorbed, which was the entire point of the Sunday timing. Hyatt's stock did not crater. The company's operational leadership was already in place. Hoplamazian had been running the hotel business for nearly 2 decades. The transition, from a corporate governance perspective, was almost seamless. That seamlessness was itself a kind of story. The man who had personified Pritzker's stewardship at Hyatt for more than 40 years was gone, and the company's share price barely registered the loss. Markets do not measure reputation. They measure cash flow, occupancy rates, revenue per available room, and the likelihood that the next quarter's earnings will meet analyst expectations. By those measures, Thomas Pritzker's departure was a footnote. By every other measure, it was the most significant event in the Pritsker family's public life since Liesel walked into court 23 years earlier. The institutional aftermath moved quickly, in the way that institutional aftermaths always move when the institutions are trying to create distance without creating spectacle. The University of Chicago announced that Pritsker would retire from the Board of Trustees in June, coinciding with what a spokesperson described as the mandatory retirement age. The timing was convenient. Whether it was also coincidental is a question the university did not invite, and the careful phrasing, mandatory retirement age, not resignation in response to Epstein disclosures, allowed the institution to process Tom's departure through administrative language rather than moral language. The university had its own reputation to manage. It had accepted the Pritsker name on its medical school. It had accepted $30 million from the family in 2002 and built programs around the gift. The name was woven into the physical and institutional fabric of one of America's most prestigious research universities. You cannot unwrap a name from a medical school the way you unwrap a gift. The endowment is spent, the building is built, the graduates carry the degree. The question of what to do when a family name becomes complicated is one that American universities have been confronting with increasing frequency. And the answer is almost always the same: nothing. The name stays. The institution issues a statement. The news cycle moves on. The Pritsker name remained on the medical school. The Pritsker name remained on the School of Molecular Engineering. The Pritsker Architecture Prize continued to be administered through the Hyatt Foundation, awarding what is widely considered the highest honor in global design, a prize that carries a $100,000 grant and a bronze medallion and the weight of nearly 5 decades of laureates, from Philip Johnson to Balkrishna Doshi to Francis Kere. The prize ceremony would continue to be held in architecturally significant locations around the world. The jury would continue to deliberate. The announcement would continue to generate international press coverage, and the family name attached to all of it would continue to carry, alongside its legacy of patronage and civic investment, the newer association with a set of emails that the prize's founders could never have anticipated. The philanthropic infrastructure that the family had built over generations did not dismantle itself because one member of the family had resigned from one company. That is how institutional philanthropy works. The name goes on the building when the gift is made. The name does not come off the building when the donor's reputation changes. The building does not care. The endowment does not care. The students walking through the doors of the Pritsker School of Medicine in 2026 were not thinking about Jeffrey Epstein. They were thinking about anatomy exams and residency matches and whether they could afford rent near the hospital. The name on the building had become, for them, wallpaper. Present but invisible, a fact of architecture rather than a fact of family history. But for the people who understood what the Pritsker name had meant in Chicago, in the specific, layered, decades deep way that civic families are understood in the cities they inhabit. The resignation carried weight that extended far beyond a corporate succession. The Pritzkers were not just hotel owners, they were Chicago. They were the kind of family that other families measured themselves against. They sat on the boards that decided which buildings got built, which medical research got funded, which cultural institutions survived, and which did not. Jay had designed the empire to be inseparable from the city's civic life, and for the most part it was. The hospitals bore the name. The museums bore the influence. The political connections ran deep. Tom's cousin, J.B. Pritsker, was the sitting governor of Illinois, a fact that ensured every piece of coverage about the Epstein emails also mentioned the state's highest office, even when the connection was purely familial rather than operational. The resignation placed the entire Pritzker civic identity under a shadow that no single press release could dispel. The family's response, to the extent it was visible, followed the Pritzker playbook: privacy, transition, institutional continuity. There was no family press conference. There was no collective statement from the Pritzker heirs. There was no public reckoning of the kind that some commentators called for and that the family had no legal obligation to provide. Tom's statement, the regret, the terrible judgment, the condemnation of Epstein and Maxwell's harm, stood as the only direct personal accounting. The Pritzker organization's website continued to list him as chairman and CEO of the family's merchant bank. His biography continued to describe his decades of work in national security, culture, education, science, and philanthropy. He had lost the Hyatt chair. He had not lost every form of influence, every institutional connection, every piece of the identity he had built over 50 years of public life. That is the uncomfortable fact at the center of this part of the story. Public accountability in the world the Pritzkers inhabit is not a binary switch. It is a dial. The resignation turned the dial. It did not turn it all the way. The political dimension was unavoidable. J.B. Pritzker, Tom's cousin, was the governor of Illinois, a billionaire in his own right, elected to the state's highest office on a platform that included the Pritzker name's civic credibility. J.B. had not been named in the Epstein documents. He had no documented connection to Epstein or Maxwell, but the family name does not come with a firewall between cousins. Every headline that said Pritzker and Epstein in the same sentence landed on the governor's desk as a political fact, regardless of the legal distance between the two men. Press coverage noted the familial connection consistently. NPR Illinois identified Tom as the governor's cousin in its reporting on the email disclosures. AP did the same. The connection was factual, not accusatory, but in politics, factual associations carry their own weight. The governor's office did not issue a detailed public response to Tom's resignation. It did not need to. The distance was already implied by the silence. The careful institutional silence that powerful families deploy when one member's private conduct threatens the collective brand. Penny Pritsker, whose role in the family's story had always been defined by competence and political navigation, occupied her own uncomfortable position in the aftermath. She had served as United States Secretary of Commerce under President Obama. She was a figure of genuine public accomplishment, a woman who had risen inside a male-dominated family structure and then risen further into federal government. She was not named in the Epstein documents. She was not connected to the social network the emails exposed. But Penny was a Pritzker, and the Pritzker name was now associated with something that no amount of cabinet-level service could counterbalance in a headline. Her situation illustrated a particular cruelty of dynasty stories. The family members who did nothing wrong are still inside the blast radius of the family members who did. The Epstein wave continued to move through other institutions and other names, and each new revelation recalibrated the public's understanding of how the network had functioned. Each new document release from the DOJ's Epstein library or from congressional committees produced fresh cycles of reporting, fresh connections between powerful figures and the dead financier's social network. The pattern was always the same. Emails surfaced, names were identified, institutions distanced themselves, individuals issued statements of regret or denial, and the public absorbed another data point in a scandal that had no single climax and no clear resolution. The scale of that scandal was itself a kind of protection for the individuals caught inside it. When dozens of prominent names are connected to the same set of documents, no single name carries the full weight of public attention for very long. The news cycle moves from one disclosure to the next. The Pritzker resignation was major news for a week. Then another cache of documents was released, and another name surfaced, and the public's attention shifted. That is not exoneration. It is not closure. It is the simple arithmetic of a scandal so large that its individual components blur into a pattern, and the pattern becomes the story rather than any single person within it. Tom Pritzker was part of the pattern. He was not the pattern itself, and that distinction, while offering no moral comfort, offered a practical one. The world moved on, even if the archive did not. The archive was designed to be permanent and continuously updated. The DOJ's Epstein library functioned less like a legal proceeding and more like a slow-motion exposure. A repository that could not be closed, holding documents that dripped names and dates and email exchanges into the public record at irregular intervals. For the people named in those documents, the archive meant that the story would never be fully over. There would always be the possibility of another release, another cache, another set of emails that added context or raised new questions or connected a known name to an unknown event. The Pritzker name was inside that system now. It would remain there as long as the archive existed. And unlike a trust settlement, which can be signed and sealed and eventually forgotten by everyone except the people who signed it, a federal document archive has no expiration date. It sits on a government server, searchable, accessible, permanent, the modern equivalent of a public record that the family's entire history had been designed to avoid creating. The parallel to the trust war is worth drawing explicitly because it illuminates the deeper pattern in the Pritzker story. In 2002, Liesel's lawsuit forced the family's financial arrangements into public view. The exposure was painful, but the category was familiar. Money, trusts, inheritance, the mechanics of who gets what. The family survived because financial disputes, however large the numbers, are understood by the public as a known species of family conflict. Rich families fight over money. It is ugly. It is human. It does not fundamentally alter the public's moral assessment of the family's place in civic life. The 2026 exposure was different in kind, not just in degree. The documents that became public were not about how the Pritzker fortune was divided. They were about who the fortune steward had chosen to spend time with and what that choice revealed about the social world that extreme wealth creates and sustains. The first exposure was financial. The second was moral. And moral exposures do not settle the way financial ones do. There is no dollar amount that resolves a question about character. Liesel and Matthew Pritzker, who had been the emotional center of the family's first public fracture, occupied a different position in the story by 2026. Their trust settlement had been finalized more than 2 decades earlier. They had received their money in roughly $280 million each in cash, plus earlier amounts. And they had, as far as the public record shows, moved on from the legal battle that had defined their adolescence and early adulthood. Liesel had been 19 when she sued. By 2026, she was in her 40s, a full generation removed from the girl who had stood outside the Daily Center while photographers captured the image of a Pritzker heir breaking the family's code of silence. Matthew had been even younger during the trust dispute. Whatever their lives had become in the intervening decades, and the public record on that question is thin, in keeping with the Pritzker tradition of privacy that survived even the family's most public rupture. They had lived long enough with the Pritzker name to understand what it meant to be inside a story you did not choose. Their role in the Epstein chapter was not direct. They were not named in the emails. They were not connected to the social network that the documents exposed. They had no documented relationship with Epstein or Maxwell. But their earlier lawsuit had established the precedent that would echo through the family's second crisis, that the Pritzker system, for all its sophistication, could not prevent its private arrangements from becoming public when someone decided the arrangements were unjust. Liesel had been the first Pritzker to break the seal. She had taken the family's private trust architecture and forced it into a courtroom. The DOJ archive was the second break, and it was not initiated by a family member, but by the federal government. Both times, it was paper that did the damage. Legal filings in 2002, email caches in 2025 and 2026. Both times, the family survived. But what they survived into was a diminished version of what they had been before. The first time, the diminishment was financial and structural. The collective empire was divided, the trusts were settled, the fiction of perfect family unity was abandoned. The second time, the diminishment was reputational and moral. The steward who was supposed to embody the family's values had demonstrated in writing that his private social world operated by different rules than his public one. The broader Pritzker empire remained intact in its fundamental architecture. The family's ownership stake in Hyatt, 54.4% of common stock, 88.9% of voting power, did not change because Tom stepped down. The Class B shares that gave the family its disproportionate control were structural, embedded in the company's corporate charter, and they would remain in place regardless of which Pritzker sat in which chair or which Pritzker's name appeared in which archive. The Pritzker organization continued to operate as the family's merchant bank and investment vehicle. The philanthropic commitments continued. The name continued to appear on buildings and prizes and endowed chairs across the country. The dynasty, as a financial and institutional entity, was not destroyed by Tom's resignation. It was embarrassed by it. And in the world of American dynastic wealth, embarrassment is survivable. It is not comfortable, and it is not forgotten, but it is survivable. Hyatt itself moved into the post-Pritzker chairmanship era with the determined steadiness of a company that had been preparing for leadership transition, even if it had not been preparing for this particular cause. The company reported more than 1,450 hotels and all-inclusive resorts across more than 80 countries on 6 continents, a global footprint that Jay Pritzker could not have imagined when he signed the purchase agreement for a single motel beside the Los Angeles airport in 1957. Hoplamazian, who had been with the company since 2006 and had overseen its expansion through the post-IPO years, its recovery from the pandemic, and its continued push into luxury and lifestyle brands, was now carrying both the chairman and CEO titles. The messaging from the company emphasized what it always emphasizes when a founding family's role diminishes: strategy, growth, global footprint, brand strength, commitment to stakeholders. The message, decoded, was simple. The company is bigger than any one person, even if that person's last name is on the original motel deed from 1957. Whether the employees at those 1,450 properties felt the same equanimity is a question that corporate press releases are not designed to answer. The man whose name was synonymous with the company they worked for had just resigned over his ties to one of the most notorious criminals of the 21st century. For the general manager of a Hyatt in Des Moines or Dubai or Dusseldorf, that fact existed in a different register than it did for securities analysts. It existed in the register of conversations with guests who read the news, of questions from friends who saw the headlines, of the small daily friction that occurs when the name on your paycheck becomes the name in a scandal. There is a version of this story, the version the family would probably prefer, the version that their lawyers and communications advisors would craft if given the chance, in which the Epstein Association is an aberration, a terrible lapse in judgment by one family member, regretted, acknowledged, and corrected through resignation. In that version, the Pritzker name recovers. The institutions endure. The philanthropy continues. The architecture prize is awarded each spring in a ceremony held in some beautiful building in some beautiful city. And nobody in the audience thinks about emails or dinner guest lists or the word news typed by a dead man to a billionaire who said he was quiet. In that version, the family's century-long project of building a respectable American dynasty succeeds, and the Epstein chapter becomes a footnote, painful, embarrassing, but ultimately survivable, the way the trust war was survivable. But there is another version, and it is the version that the full sweep of the Pritzker story, from Nicholas selling newspapers on a Chicago street corner to Tom stepping down from the boardroom his father built, makes difficult to avoid. In that version, the Epstein Association is not an aberration. It is a symptom of what happens when wealth builds rooms that ordinary accountability cannot enter. The Pritzker fortune was designed, from Nicholas's law office to Jay's 1,000 trusts, to Tom's executive chairmanship, to create privacy. Privacy for the family's financial arrangements, privacy for its internal disputes, privacy for its succession planning, privacy for the social lives of the people who controlled the money, and privacy, when it is absolute enough and sustained enough and protected by enough lawyers and trust and corporate structures, does not just shield the family from public scrutiny. It also shields the family's members from the social consequences that less wealthy people experience when they make choices that the public would find unacceptable. A school teacher who maintained a 9-year email correspondence with a convicted sex offender would lose their job the day the emails surfaced. A mid-level corporate manager who joked about rearranging models at a dinner hosted by a sex trafficker's accomplice would be terminated and would not find comparable employment again. Tom Pritzker resigned from one of his many positions and retained the rest: the merchant bank, the advisory boards, the philanthropic roles, the wealth, the name. That is not hypocrisy. It is architecture. The same architecture that built the hospitals and the prizes also built the room where 20 emails over 9 years could go unnoticed by anyone who did not have access to a federal document archive. Thomas J. Pritzker is 75 years old. He is a former executive chairman of Hyatt Hotels Corporation. He remains, according to his organization's public biography, the chairman and CEO of the Pritsker organization, active in national security advisory roles, cultural institutions, scientific initiatives, and philanthropic work. He has not been charged with a crime related to the Epstein investigations. He has acknowledged terrible judgment. He has expressed regret. He lives inside the architecture his family built, an architecture that includes hotels on 6 continents, a medical school, an architecture prize, a governor's mansion, and a federal document archive that will outlast all of them. Hyatt Hotels Corporation is now led by Mark S. Hoplamassian as chairman, president, and CEO. The company operates more than 1,450 properties worldwide. The Pritsker family retains its controlling voting interest. The Pritzker Architecture Prize is still awarded annually. The Pritzker School of Medicine still trains doctors. The name is still on the buildings. The DOJ's Epstein library is still online. It was last updated in April of 2026. The search function works. The documents are public. Anyone with an internet connection can type a name and see what the archive returns. The archive does not close. The Pritzker story is not a neat morality play about one bad email or one resignation or one family's fall from grace. It is about the distance between wealth as stewardship and wealth as insulation. For more than a century, the Pritzkers built structures meant to preserve money, privacy, and institutional power across generations. Those structures produce hotels that employ tens of thousands of people, a medical school that trains physicians, an architecture prize that honors the best work in global design, and philanthropic commitments that have shaped Chicago's civic life for decades. Those same structures also produced rooms where decisions were made far from public view, rooms where trust documents could be restructured without telling the beneficiaries, where emails with a convicted sex offender could accumulate across 9 years without consequence, where the social grammar of elite dinner parties could reduce young women to serving decorations, and the exchange could read as banter rather than warning. What remains after Thomas Pritzker's resignation is not the destruction of the dynasty. It is something more complicated and more enduring. The sight of a name still standing on every building where it was placed, while the paper beneath it tells a story the buildings were never meant to hold.